Welcome to A Dad's Path, where we navigate the heart and science of parenting. Each episode, we tackle issues that dads everywhere face and deliver actions you can take right away. Join us as we uncover the balancing act of raising resilient, loving kids. Visit us at adadspath.com to learn more. Ready for the journey? Let's begin. Hello, and welcome to another episode of A Dad's Path podcast. I'm Will Bronstein. Today I'm here with Dr. Jamil Zaki. He's a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the director of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. He trained at Columbia and Harvard, studying empathy and kindness in the human brain, and he's interested on how we can learn to connect better, which is obviously super important for parents and super important to teach our kids as well. He has a new book called Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness, where he imparts the secrets of conquering cynicism, which he calls hopeful skepticism. We'll go through that, obviously, in the podcast here. And you can get his book wherever books are sold. Bookshop.org is a great one, since that supports independent bookstores and all the other big guys as well, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. And you can learn more about Jamil on his lab website, ssnl.stanford.edu. That'll be in our show notes as well. But I'm really excited for this. Welcome, Jamil. Thanks for joining us.
Will, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to just kind of dive in. And first, what inspired you to write Hope for Cynics? And maybe if you could give a brief overview of your journey in the field of neuroscience, social neuroscience, that kind of brought you here.
Yeah, of course. So I was inspired to write Hope for Cynics because of a conflict that I felt inside myself. I've spent 20 years now studying the science of human goodness in various ways. So in grad school, and since then, I've been using brain imaging to study empathy and kindness. And in my work, also discovered all these different ways that kindness benefits people, both people who act kindly and people who receive kindness. So over the course of my career, I kind of became a little bit of a scientific evangelist for pointing out how great people can be and all these positive qualities of human nature. But Will, as you know from the book, I also have lived that entire time with a bit of a secret. Even though outwardly, and as a scientist, I've been demonstrating all these cases for human goodness, internally, I've always been a little bit cynical myself. That's not to say that I don't believe the science, but there's a difference sometimes between your head and your heart. And for me, I always have believed the science. I've always believed, based on my evidence and that of so many other people, that humanity generally is an empathic and kind species. But sometimes emotionally, it would be hard for me to connect with that. I sometimes have had trouble trusting people. I can be really a suspicious person sometimes. And so I wrote the book to try to explore what was happening inside me, because it turns out I'm not alone. People trust each other much less than we did 50 years ago. We trust our institutions much less than we used to. We trust education less, science less, medicine less, and that distrust is hurting us. And so in trying to study this, trying to explore what was happening in myself, I realized I was actually exploring what was happening to a lot of people who were growing more cynical. And through my research, I actually discovered how cynicism, although we think it's wise, actually is often naive, and how taking a more hopeful approach can be really wise. And so when I learned that, that's when I realized, okay, this is a message that's not just about exploring my own experience, but could be valuable for other people too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to, the cynicism rings true on a couple levels. One, I guess my first question is, why does it seem smart to be cynical, but ultimately it's kind of unhelpful?
Okay, so great question. Let's stipulate first that people do see cynics as wise. So in lots of studies, researchers have told people about two individuals, one of whom is cynical and suspicious, and the other of whom is hopeful and trusting. 70% of people in these studies will tell you that the cynical individual is smarter than the less cynical one, than the hopeful person. 85% of people will tell you that the cynical person is more socially smart, meaning that they would be a better and sharper judge of character. So we have this stereotype in our culture that being cynical, distrusting others, is a smart and wise way to be. And I think that that comes from a really good and smart evolutionary place that has gone in the wrong direction. So, why would it be smart? Well, I guess if you need to pay attention to either threats or positive things in your environment, you should probably pay attention to threats. It's safe to ignore a sunset, but not safe to ignore a tsunami, right? And the same is true of other people. If you trust somebody and get taken advantage of, that can really harm you in lots of ways. Betrayal stings and hurts and can be quite dangerous. If you don't trust somebody and you miss out on an opportunity to connect with them, you don't get as much feedback. You don't realize that you've made a mistake. So, therefore, it can seem wiser to be cynical because you avoid obvious threats. The problem is that that logic doesn't really carry us very far because by trying to stay safe, by trying to not lose in social interactions, we also end up not winning, right? A cynic might block themselves off from other people. They might not take chances on another person. And that might keep them, quote unquote, safe. But it's only safe in the way that being under house arrest is safe, right? Because you also lose all of these opportunities to connect with new people, to make new friends, to build your network, to parent more effectively as well. And so I think that there's an apparent wisdom to cynicism that actually isn't real when you dig further into it.
Yeah, oh, that's interesting. I just hadn't thought of that before. But I think you're right. If you start to unpack it and say, okay, like for my friendships, let's say I'm trying to make a new friend as an adult, which is obviously not obviously, but for me, a hard thing to do, a hard thing to do. So we'll just say, so what's the worst thing if I put myself out there and I ask someone and I try and get together with them, the very worst thing that happens in our social world is they say no, or, I mean, if I'm really making things up in my mind, they make fun of me. I mean, I don't know, right? But there's no real harm that can happen there. It's not. So I think once you start like digging a little deeper and thinking it through, saying, well, why am I thinking like this? And what am I really, I mean, it's about fear, right? What am I afraid of? It's makes sense to kind of cut it off and say, well, let's look at the other side. I think you frame this term hopeful skepticism, right? Like,
Yeah.
let's be hopefully, I don't know how to say it, skeptical, I guess. But so that's a big part of your book, just that idea. So can you explain the concept of hopeful skepticism?
Absolutely. Before I do, I just want to co-sign something that you said, Will, because my goodness, what you're saying rings so true to me as well. Forming new friendships as somebody in midlife with children, it just feels like such an uphill climb, doesn't it, sometimes? And I share your perspective too. I often, when I think about trying to reach out to somebody new or maybe deepen a friendship with a parent who, we see each other at drop off every day, and I think, wow, that seems like a really cool person. I think about all the things that could go wrong. I think about I think about it being really awkward or them judging me. I hope that they wouldn't make fun of me. But again, these things are so rare. And there's a bunch of evidence that we overestimate the likelihood of bad things happening when we reach out to people. I call this social shark attacks because, shark attacks are extraordinarily rare, but they're so vivid that we overestimate how likely they are and then do all sorts of stuff to avoid them. Likewise, I think we've all been in an awkward social situation at one point or another. I mean, gosh, I remember seventh grade, it's a very tough time. And so I think that we often over rotate. We say, well, I remember being betrayed or disappointed or made fun of. And that lives in your mind for so long that it's easy to adopt a defensive posture and say, well, I just don't want to experience that again, so I won't try. But it turns out that when there's a bunch of research that shows when you actually get people to sort of step out of their comfort zone and engage with somebody in a deeper way, they're shocked by how positively it goes. And so I think that we should interrogate that. We should ask ourselves, why are we so surprised when people are friendly, given that when you reach out to somebody, in the majority of cases, they're much friendlier than we imagine.
Yeah, no, thank you for co-signing that. It makes me feel a little bit, a little bit better. And I think that's where hopeful skepticism comes in, right? Having a different perspective. And so, do you mind sharing what that concept is and maybe how it's different from cynicism?
Of course, yeah. So there's two terms in hopeful skepticism, both of which I think are slightly misunderstood in our culture. The first is hope. So a lot of people think of hope as the same as optimism. Like if you're hopeful, you've got your head buried in the sand, you're naive, you assume that things will go well despite all the evidence. Optimism is the belief that things will go well. Hope is the belief that they could go well. And optimism can leave us complacent. If you just assume that your life is going to go great, you might not work very hard. You might not avoid things that are real dangers. Hope is different. Hope is the understanding that we have some control over what happens in the future, that the future is uncertain. And in that uncertainty lies our ambitions, our striving to improve our lives and to improve the world in whatever small way we might. So that's the hopeful piece, is understanding that even when things are tough, even when they're awful, that they could improve and that we have a hand in helping them improve. Skepticism is often confused with cynicism. And they're really quite different. Cynicism is the belief that in general people are untrustworthy and selfish and greedy. Skepticism is withholding any judgment. It's thinking more like a scientist, and waiting for evidence before making a decision. So a cynic, for instance, will meet somebody new and say, I'm sure that they have ulterior motives for whatever they're saying. This person is just trying to get one over on me. A skeptic wouldn't assume either way. They wouldn't assume that the person is untrustworthy. They also wouldn't assume the person is trustworthy. It's actually a more neutral stance to the world, one in which we are open to learning from other people who they are and what role they might play in our lives. So if you combine those, hope and skepticism, you end up with a very open-minded but not naive approach to the world, a mindset in which you allow people to teach us who they are, and you also realize that there's the potential for great goodness in people, in our relationships, and in what we can do together as a culture.
I love that. No, it's a great term, and the way you unpacked it is perfect. I agree. And hope is so important, and the skepticism on its own feels maybe a little negative, but adding the hopeful to it gives you that tinge without being just all optimistic. I mean, and optimism has its place, I think, too. But I think the term really makes sense. And then, if we move a little deeper there and say, okay, as parents, why is hopeful skepticism particularly important? Like, why do you think that's maybe it's not, but why do you think that's a better term or better approach than optimism, for example?
Oh my gosh, I have so many things to say about this. I'm going to try to keep it brief, but I want to hear your thoughts. And I know you think so much about parenting, and I'd love to hear how you feel about this stuff. But maybe I can start, Will, with my experience of parenting. So have you ever seen the Terminator movies?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, in the Terminator movies, Arnold Schwarzenegger has this sort of Terminator vision. He sizes everything up with augmented reality. So he's looking at something and he sees what size pants a guy is wearing or what size jacket he's wearing. He knows all the firearms in front of him. He can classify them instantaneously. I remember when I became a parent, it actually made me temporarily more cynical because I felt like my role was to protect my daughters above all else. So I developed Terminator vision, and it was for every potential threat in their environment. And that included, I immediately sized up every sharp corner, every electrical outlet, anything that could be a danger. But it also included social dangers. We live in San Francisco, and I remember suddenly being really uneasy around people. If I was pushing my daughter in a stroller, I would be sizing people up and saying, is this person a threat? And I realized I was falling into a trap that I think is really easy and understandable for parents to fall into, but maybe not very helpful. And that is of passing on cynicism to our children. We want to protect our kids, but oftentimes in doing so, we give them a really bleak view of the world. One example of this was way back in the 70s and 80s, there was this whole really what I would say a moral panic around kidnapping. I don't know, you remember these milk cartons, like every milk carton would have a kid on it that had been kidnapped. And there was this real fear. I mean, there was a point in the 1980s where if you asked kids, do you think it's likely that you'll be kidnapped? Almost half of them would say, yes, I do. We believed that strangers were this enormous threat, and there was this term for it, stranger danger, that we were supposed to teach our kids to be scared of people because that would keep them safe. I think that that's actually really quite damaging to kids potentially, because it teaches them that they can't trust the world, and it teaches them to shrink their own the circumference of their life, really, in order to stay safe. But safe isn't all that we want. We also want kids who are open to the world and able to interact with people. And I worry that in our understandable and natural desire to protect them, we might be inadvertently instilling cynicism into them.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I don't disagree at all, unfortunately, and that's the balance we need to strike. And I like that term you talked about earlier, the social shark attacks, right? I mean, I think that's kind of along those lines. So, how would you recommend, as parents, we can guard against those, social shark attacks, or the stranger danger? That's, you want a healthy level, certainly, but by the same token, with the social, I mean, I love that term, social shark attacks, because that's right on. It's like you go to a beach and you're scared of sharks, and like, how often does that happen? Like, what are the odds, right? And if you look at the probability, you're like, oh, wait a second, this isn't logical. So yeah, like, how would you recommend families guard against that, or parents guard against that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about habits of mind and habits of speech, right? I mean, our kids are, as of course, as we all know, are sponges. They pick up so much. They're little scientists, and we are providing the data that they use to build their model of the world, right? And so I realized when my kids were 3 or 4 that I was really giving them quite bad data, because partially because I was trying to protect them against shark attacks, and partially because I could sometimes be grumpy and sleep deprived. And so I would notice and comment on sort of threatening or negative people in the world, on the news, in traffic. When somebody cut me off on the way to drop them off at school, gosh, they would learn terrible things about that person. And for me, I think it was a actually, parenting was a chance to interrogate and to challenge my views. I kind of said to myself, well, if I instill this in my kids, it's probably going to hurt them. I mean, cynicism hurts people at basically every level we can measure. And so I thought, well, let me try what I called social savoring. So what I tried to make sure that I did was every day comment authentically, not in a disingenuous way, but find authentic examples of people acting positively, people being really kind or helpful, and to share those examples with my kids, to focus their attention on everyday human goodness. And that habit of speech will then turn into a habit of mind. As you know, oftentimes what you try to teach your kids, you end up teaching yourself instead. And so I noticed that in trying to notice positivity, it was really quite easy to find. And that changed my own mindset. It actually opened me up in a way to the everyday goodness all around me. So it was this sort of evolution from the outside in, if you will, right? That talking about something made me see it more clearly. And that's one habit I would suggest parents try out, at least, is to understand that we're providing our kids data and see, can we stop presenting them with data that are negatively biased? I'm not saying, again, to paper over problems. I'm not saying to ignore threats, but rather to balance out what we provide to our children.
Yeah, that's a brilliant idea. I love that. I'm gonna start doing that. I mean, articulating out loud in front of my kids positive things I'm seeing, because they always, if you don't actively do it, it's sort of unnatural. Where it's unfortunately more natural to bring out the, I don't know if cynic's the right word, but the, like, why'd that person cut me off? Why is that person not following the rules and doing X and Y? Like, you identify that and you want to say it, but you just see something nice happening. You don't necessarily feel that same urge, right? So I think that's a
Yeah.
brilliant strategy.
So, well, I'm glad it resonates, and I would add to that. In addition to the habits that we engage in terms of communication with our kids, I also think there's a meta theory, a theory about parenting that we need to correct. So it turns out that if you ask parents in surveys, in studies, what will help your kids, they will tell you that being distrustful will be good for their kids. So there was one study from some sociologists published, about 10 years ago, where they surveyed parents and they said, do you trust strangers? And what do you tell your kids to do? And even parents who themselves were trusting said, yeah, I teach my kids to not be trusting because I think that's better for them. So you're basically saying what's good for me is not good for my kid. There's another study more recently that focused on what this psychologist Jer Clifton calls primal beliefs. These are your general beliefs about the world. So, for instance, is the world a safe or a dangerous place? Is it a cooperative or competitive place? And Jer asked hundreds of parents, what do you think would help your kid most? To believe that the world is dangerous or to believe that it's safe? And most parents thought that their kids would thrive if they believed the world was dangerous more than if they believed it was safe. Jer, the psychologist, then looked at people who believe the world is dangerous versus safe and found that people who believe the world is dangerous are less healthy physically and mentally and do less well in their careers over time. So, in essence, again, this totally understandable instinct to protect our kids drives us to a model of parenting that might actually be making them more anxious, less connected, and less successful. Trends that I think we're seeing in kids, increasingly over time. And yes, it might be the phones, it might be the devices, but it might also be our strategies around parenting that are backfiring. So, in addition to everyday habits, I would encourage parents, and I certainly try to do this myself, to interrogate what we think we want for our kids and what we actually want for them, and whether we might be inadvertently guiding them in directions that are the opposite of what we actually want for them in the long run.
Yeah, well, that's very smart. And I think taking that, we should all take that data that you just, quoted and say, okay, we need to learn that this is bad for our kids. This is bad for us. It's bad for our kids. So regardless of what our, prior thinking might be, let's update it. Let's agree that we want our kids to be trusting. We want them to live in a world where they're naturally, hopefully skeptical, but yet that's where you have to start, I think, is saying, okay, how do we view the world? And if we're viewing it in a way that we think is not, is a little more cynical, let's update that. That's okay. We can update, we're humans, and that's an amazing part of being human is we can change our views, right? So I think that is really important.
Well, and it's not easy either. It's really hard to update your beliefs and update your. I mean, we're so many of us attached to our parenting style, not just to our kids. And I think that it's for me with my kids, it's been a real journey, and I try to be open with them. I try to say, I try to tell them I sometimes have trouble trusting people. I sometimes have trouble with this stuff. So let's work on it together. It can be a group project, if you will.
No, I like that. Yeah, I mean, being open and so because they're not going to necessarily feel comfortable or even be able to identify that enough to articulate it, right? So by you bringing out to the forefront, by us bringing it to the forefront, we're giving our kids the opportunity to also, not keep it inside, but also just be more open and say, hey, I'm feeling this way. Is this normal? Is this weird? Am I a strange, and make them feel better about themselves. And because we all have our ups and downs, and that's just part of life. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right.
And you've given a couple examples. I love that example of, articulating positive things you're seeing, as you see them, maybe, aim for once a day or something, for helping your kids develop that, that hopeful skepticism mindset. I mean, is that say, hey, maybe you guys should start identifying something once a day, or what other advice would you give to parents who are saying, my kid is seeming a little cynical? They didn't get it from me for sure. I mean, about that, but but how do you turn that train around? I think the example you gave is a great one for us, and then that'll also transfer. But do you have other ideas or things that you've seen work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of parents, a lot of thoughtful parents, do some form of gratitude practice with their kids, around the dinner table. What's something good that happened today? And that's great. Uh, I would say that to combat cynicism in particular, it might be nice to focus on social gratitude, right? I mean, gratitude could be, I'm grateful it was sunny out today, or I'm grateful that there was, that school lunch was something that I really, it's for my kids always, it was mac and cheese. If it was mac and cheese, that's a great day, but we can focus our gratitude practices as a family on what people did today. And it turns out that's one of the most reliable sources of positivity in our lives. My friend Dacher Keltner at Berkeley studies awe, these experiences that make you feel elevated, that make you feel connected to the world, even the universe. And when you think about awe, you might think about seeing an image of the Milky Way galaxy or standing in the middle of a tall redwood forest. But Dacher surveyed thousands of people over and over again, sort of asking them every day, what gave you an experience of awe today? And he found that the most common experience of awe was witnessing everyday virtue, was witnessing people acting in positive ways that they didn't have to. So, and those actions are everywhere. And so, what I would suggest for parents who think that their kids might be struggling with cynicism is to issue them a challenge. Notice notice social goodness every day. Find something that you're socially grateful for, and report back at dinner. And again, if sort of getting in that hunter's mindset, right, looking for examples of something brings them out. It changes the way that you see the world. So we can challenge ourselves to do that for our kids, and we can challenge our kids to do that for themselves as well.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And also, like you said, the gratitude practice and creating maybe rituals and traditions that help foster that thinking, right? And say, okay, well, every night before dinner, some families say grace, some families, just start eating, and our family is going to just go around real quick and say one thing we're all grateful for the day, and
Yeah.
that will help build that. And I think along those lines, you could also volunteer once a month or something like that
Yes.
with your kids, or
Yes.
if not appropriate, you can go and tell them about it. Make sure you're explaining why you're helping, what you're doing. But the human virtue thing, that's so important. And I love that study of awe, like that you were telling us about, because it's also easy to, live in our little world and be like, I woke up, I dropped my kid off to school, I went to work, and I picked him up, and I came home. And it's easy to ignore and say, yeah, I don't have awe because I don't live in the redwoods and I don't live in Fiji or whatever it is. I'm not looking at a beach sunset. But in
Yeah.
reality, the science says, hey, that's not what it is. That's beautiful, but that's not, you can get it every day.
Absolutely. I mean, what we bring with us, whether we're in Fiji or on the subway, is our mindset and our perspective. And that is transformative for how we experience life and the world. And, I'm sure that many parents think a lot about growth mindset. Carol Dweck's work is, of course, legendary by now in the world of education and parenting. And it's great. We see our kids as people who can grow. I think it's really important to understand just how many aspects of ourselves we can grow. Growth mindset is really easy to think about when it comes to intelligence. But it's also true that hope is a muscle, that empathy is a muscle, that our ability to relate with other people is a muscle as well. I've met lots of folks who think that you can get smarter, but don't think that you can get more connected. They think of these emotional qualities of our lives as more fixed, but they're not. And so that's another important message, I think, for parents, is to realize that we and our children can grow in all of these ways, including in our perspective on the world.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that muscle analogy, because it's very clear in our mind, like you can build it up, you can grow it like a muscle. And by that same token, you can let muscles atrophy, which you
Yes.
maybe do with the cynicism
Yes. Yes.
muscle, so to speak. What I'd be curious, I think, again, we all have ups and downs, and our kids are no different, and some of their emotions might even be more extreme. How would you identify if cynicism is causing issues in your family versus being just, okay, everyone gets a little sad sometimes? Like, what is there a line you would draw, or how would you identify that?
That's a really great question. Cynicism is a combination of feelings and beliefs, right? So we all get sad and anxious sometimes. Some of us get sad and anxious a lot of the time. Uh, it's more the judgments that we attach to it that can turn it into cynicism. So, one question is, are we taking in our families, whether it's us or our children, are we taking single events and turning them into theories about the world? The comedian George Carlin said, inside every cynic is a disappointed idealist, right? So we all suffer betrayals. We all have bad days. And people really are mean and cruel and awful sometimes. The question is whether we take those experiences and generalize them. I call this going from being disappointed to being pre-disappointed, right? Somebody harms you in some way. Of course, it's natural to react to that. When we then decide everybody else is going to do the same thing, this is how people are, well, then you've veered into cynicism, right? You've generalized in a way that probably isn't helpful. So that's one cynicism detection method, would be to ask whether we are keeping our reactions sorry, let me take that again. That's one way of detecting cynicism, is to ask, are my reactions to an event, even a negative event, are they staying with that event, or are they spiraling out into my view of people as a whole, the world as a whole? How judgmental am I becoming based on those experiences? And if you notice, either in yourself or your kids, that, wow, this is ballooning into, I just don't trust people, I don't believe in people, that might be time for a cynicism intervention.
No, that's a great definition and a great explanation. I think you're right. And, I think by that same token, if we can have that hopeful skepticism and we can keep articulating it, so even when our kids seem a little, cynical in our minds, we can say, yeah, that's true. That was really mean of your friend to say, I don't want to play with you today and play with someone else. But you know what? You have other friends. You have, there's a lot of people who aren't like that. And maybe they just had a day and that's just what they wanted to do. And you can, I guess that's the line of optimism slash uh, truth, right? And hopeful skepticism, right? And that's, I also like that definition where optimism is just always thinking rosy, right? Whereas hopeful skepticism is saying, listen, things aren't always beautiful and in that way, but things are also not always terrible. Like we can be hopeful and we can be optimistic without everything being rosy optimism, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that you put it really well. I mean, we certainly don't want to walk through the world wearing rose-colored glasses. We don't want to be taken advantage of. And Lord knows that when people are mean to my kids, I get so protective and so angry. And I do want them to separate from those people. I don't want them to continue to be made fun of or taken advantage of. Of course, nobody wants that for themselves, and certainly not for their children. But I think the trick is, when you take off the rose colored glasses, don't then put on a pair of dirt colored glasses, right? Don't then allow those negative experiences to color, to dim your view of everybody else. That actually is sort of one of the ways that bullies can win, is if they shrink us, if they change us and limit who we become afterwards, right? And so I think that we want to empower ourselves, not empower people who are seeking to cause harm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that covered glasses analogy there. That's right on, or metaphor. In terms of, you have their friends and things that are somewhat controlled. You go to a school, so you sort of know the parents, you sort of know the kids. You feel pretty good about that. But then there's this whole outside world, of you touched on it a little bit, but technology and media that can kind of breed, it seems like, cynicism in some ways. How do you take on those type of technologies? How do you fight that with still being, an optimist, still being hopeful, skeptic? How do you teach your kids to learn? Because I think the term doom scrolling
Yes.
is there for a reason, right? Because
Yeah.
the world's bad, the world's bad, the world's bad. This is happening. So how do you counteract that? Probably both with ourselves, but then also with our kids.
It's so tricky, Will. And here I think it's important to remember a few things. One, our minds tend to be biased towards negative information. Two, our conversations tend to be biased towards negative information. So in my lab, we found that when we give people a chance to gossip, they're much more likely to gossip about people who are causing harm as opposed to helpful people. So when we spread information, we tend to spread information about bad actors as opposed to good ones. That then skews our perception of the world, because if we're all talking about bad people and then we're all hearing about the worst people in others' lives, well, we end up thinking that those people are much more prevalent than they really are. And that's true on social media as well. Work in my lab has found that people overestimate the percentage of online users who are toxic by more than 10 times, right? So we asked people, for instance, on the website Reddit, what percentage of Reddit users do you think post toxic comments? And then we used an algorithm to determine what the real answer was. I wonder, Will, if you might guess. I don't know if you use Reddit, but if you imagine a giant social media platform, what percentage of users do you think would post toxic content?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so with Reddit, it's not a social network, right? You
Yeah.
don't. It's not like Facebook, so you don't know the people.
Yeah.
You're hiding behind usernames. Uh, I guess half or so.
Yeah. So, Will, you're close to our respondents. Our respondents guessed between 30 and 50% of users. The real answer is 3% of users post
Wow.
toxic content, right? So we, because of the way that social media is built, because of the way that it's skewed, because it exists not to make us happy or accurate about people, but rather to keep us online, it presents us algorithmically with toxic content. And we end up vastly overestimating how toxic people are when we go on those sites. It's really, I think of these devices as cynicism machines at this point. And, I think that there's a bunch of stuff we can do about that, both for ourselves and our kids. The first is to simply resist, right? So, and obviously every parent can do this however they want. In my school, I feel we're lucky that we have something called Wait Until 8, where we are part of a group of parents who have committed. Our kids are in second and first grade, and we've committed to not give them smartphones until they're at least in eighth grade, which I know is a long time to wait. But that's one thing, is we just don't want them exposed to that at this particular age. And again, there's no judgment to anybody else for their choices, but that's a choice that we made. A second is, and I try to do this myself, is to take regular social media fasts, right? Or cleanses, right? So I'll take 2-week periods whenever I can to just go offline. A second thing is, if you are online, to understand and be mindful of the fact that you're not receiving an accurate representation of the world, that you're receiving a representation of the world that is being baked by a very sophisticated algorithm to make you feel scared and mistrustful and angry, because those are the emotions that will keep you online. And then a third step that you can take is, given that awareness, ask yourself, are there other sources of information that might be a little bit more accurate, or at least balance out this negativity? There's a bunch of great websites. They're not social media platforms, but great websites. One is called Reasons to Be Cheerful, which was founded by the singer of the Talking Heads, a great band, David Byrne. And this is a site that presents positive news. And I'm not talking about like a kitten rescued a puppy or something like that. These are stories about people facing real world challenges in creative ways. And the Solutions Journalism Network is a very similar site that, again, focuses on what people are doing to make the world better. So I, at least if I'm online, try to spend as much time on those sites as I do on Twitter or other social media platforms, just to balance out, as a palate cleanser for the information that I know is going to come to me online. And once my kids are online, I hope to encourage them to likewise balance their social media diets.
Yeah, well, that's really smart. I mean, it makes sense. Somewhere like Twitter, their goal is to get more engagement. They want you to stay on the site and click. And unfortunately, cynicism can help drive that. Whereas the other sites you just mentioned, their goal is to show the positive. So that's just a totally different objective. And obviously, you'll get much different outcomes due to that. So I think those are really good. I'm going to put those in the show notes. And the Wait Until 8 also is a brilliant idea. That's one. you kind of need your tribe to agree to,
Yes.
your kids' tribe. But if you can, that's, yeah, a great idea. I'd be curious. There's smartphones and there's just screen time, just TV or shows on the iPad or whatnot. Um, how do you personally go about either setting limits or how do you approach that with your kids, and how would you recommend that we do with ours? If
Well,
that's
let me just say that I'm a psychologist, but I'm not a parenting expert. So this is just my own intuitive approach to this stuff. I mean, we think of TV time, screen time as earned in our house. So, if we're all playing on the same team, then we can watch TV. And we differentiate between things that we're watching together as a family and sort of people just zoning out and watching what they want to watch. So, for instance, it's the NBA playoffs. This is a Golden State Warriors household, but I'm a Boston Celtics dad, so so we sometimes will watch basketball together. And I think of watching something together as really fundamentally different. I think of it as quite a positive activity. Actually, sometimes we're watching the Harry Potter movies together now as we read the books, so that's different. But when it comes to kind of solo zoning out, we try to limit it to 30 minutes on weekdays and then an hour on weekends, usually in two 30-minute chunks. But gosh, I mean, that's just back of the napkin math that my wife and I came up with when our kids were cognizant of television. What's your practice, Will? What are your habits around this?
Yeah, no, it's a challenge. It's similar. We have a set amount of time per day. Once they've gotten their work done, there's we do piano and things like that, and but yeah, let them zone out. 30 minutes to an hour, kind of depending. Which on one hand feels a little much, but on the other, you start going down that road, and that's the road you're down. So we're working on adjusting that, but it seems like right now it's working. Our kids are getting their stuff done. They're playing with each other after screen time. There's enough time in the day. As time gets tighter, just with real life, that might change, but. Uh, yeah, it's a challenge. And I love the family movie. We do family movie nights. I think that's
Yeah,
brilliant with like what you're doing with Harry Potter, for example. And that way
yeah,
it's not a total zone out. It's a bonding time together. You can laugh
exactly.
together.
That's right. I think co-experiencing is really important, even if it's co-experiencing something like a TV show or a video game. I will say that I think that I guess I have a less harsh view of screen time because I think kids are just so busy these days. I mean, the amount of scheduling that they have just seems a lot higher than it was when I was a kid. And I also think that this can lend itself to cynicism in certain ways. I remember applying to our kids' elementary schools. We were looking at independent schools in San Francisco. And my goodness, I was as nervous for those interviews as I was for my own college interview. It seems like there's this sense of an achievement arms race where kids are really expected to do so much. And I think that there's a lot of reasons to resist that. And you know I don't think that screen time is the best thing on earth, but I also think idling a little bit and just resting your mind and zoning out is not always a bad thing, especially in this hyper busy world that we've built for our children.
Yeah, no, that's a great note to end on. I totally agree. I mean, there's positives and negatives with anything. But I think ultimately the way we think as parents, is something we really should interrogate better, as you put it, and get away from being cynical and understand when we are thinking cynically and understand that the science says that doesn't make sense, in a
Yeah.
social perspective, that we should be hopeful skeptics. I love that term. And I love this interview. I loved your book, Jamil. I'd recommend anyone check it out. My listeners here, Hope for Cynics. You can get it at bookshop.org or again, wherever books are sold. And I'll have more of the links in our show notes. But thank you, Jamil. This has been tremendous.
Will, this has been such a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.